"You rode into my heart uninvited," said the Apache woman after the cowboy saved her child. The boy's boot was still there. One small boot, soft-soled, made from something tanned fine, rabbit maybe, or fox, sitting upright in the mud on the near bank like someone had set it there careful. I remember staring at it longer than made sense while my horse blew air through her nose and stamped, nervous, the way she got when water ran fast and cold. The creek was up. 3 days of rain had turned it mean, and the sound it made was a sound you felt in your back teeth. The boot shouldn't have been there alone. That was the thought that wouldn't leave. I'd come down off the ridge to water the mare. I hadn't talked to another person in 11 days. Hadn't wanted to. I was riding through that country the way a man rides when he doesn't have anywhere particular to be and isn't sure anymore that anywhere particular would suit him. I had money enough to last me a while. I had a good horse. I had a bedroll and a coffee pot, and a Winchester I kept clean more out of habit than expectation. I was 53 years old, and I had come to a kind of understanding with myself that what my life was going to be, it had already been most of it. That's not self-pity, that's just arithmetic. I'd had a wife. Her name was Cora, and she died of a fever 9 years back, and the ranch we had built together in the hill country was sold 2 years after that because I couldn't figure out what a ranch was for without her standing in the doorway of it at evening. I'd done some work for a while driving cattle, scouting once for an army unit that was mostly boys too young to shave, but it had all just been motion, something to point my body at. I wasn't unhappy exactly. I was something else. Emptied out, maybe. Like a good jug that had been drained and rinsed and sat on the shelf so long the cork had dried and cracked. That boot. I sat the mare for maybe half a minute, and then I said something to her, some quiet nothing, and stepped down, tied her to a willow branch, walked over to the boot and picked it up, turned it in my hands. Inside there was a small painted mark, a single line of ochre, and the leather smelled like smoke and pine resin. I looked out at the water. It was moving hard, white over the rocks in the middle channel, brown and thick at the edges where it had spread into the grass. I looked downstream, then upstream. Then I heard it, or thought I did, a thin sound barely over the water noise but persistent. High, wordless, not a bird. I went upstream at a jog. He was caught in a root ball, maybe 40 yards up, where a big cottonwood had come down across the bank and its roots had pulled and left a tangle half in the water. The boy was maybe 4 years old, maybe 5. He'd gotten his arm locked through 2 roots, and that was the only reason he hadn't gone. He was face up, the water moving over his legs and around his chest, and he was looking straight up at the sky with his mouth open and that sound coming out of him. Not quite a cry. More like a sound a person makes when they've been afraid so long they've gone beyond the pitch of it into something lower and steadier. A sound of pure cold endurance. I went in without taking my boots off. The water hit me like a wall, not deep thigh-high, but the current was enough to lean on, and I got to the root ball and I worked the boy's arm out of the tangle, which took some doing because he'd twisted in his panic and the roots had him snug. He didn't fight me. He was too far gone for fighting. He just kept making that sound until I had him up against my chest, and then he went quiet, clamped his arms around my neck, and pressed his face into my collar. I carried him out of the water. I sat down on the bank with him in my lap and held him and rubbed his back and said nothing in particular, just sounds, and after a while he started to shake. That shaking was good. It meant he was warm enough to shake. I pulled off my coat, soaked as it was still something, and wrapped it around him and kept rubbing. I don't know how long we sat like that. Long enough that the sky changed. Long enough that I stopped noticing the cold of my own wet clothes. Then I heard a horse. She came down off the ridge at a run, and she rode the way not many people ride, low and forward, like she and the animal were the same creature with the same intention. And she pulled up on the far bank and was off before the horse stopped moving, and she was in the water, and then she was on my side of it, and she had the boy. I let him go. I just opened my arms and she took him. She held him the way a person holds something they thought they'd lost. Both arms, face buried in his hair, rocking slightly, and she was talking to him low and fast in a language I didn't know, and the boy talked back, or tried to, his voice still thin and wavering. She ran her hands over his arms and his head and his face, checking him, and then she held him again. I sat there on the bank with my wet clothes going cold against me, and I watched her, and I felt, very strangely, not like a stranger watching a private thing, but like a man who has been asked to hold something important and has held it until the right person came. After a while she looked at me. She was maybe 35. Her hair was black and loosened from the ride, and there was mud on her knee and on one hand. Her face was, I won't say beautiful, though she was. What I mean is her face had a quality that stopped me, a held quality, like a person who has learned to keep what they feel in a place where it still belongs to them. She looked at me the way someone looks at a thing they're trying to understand correctly, and I looked back and didn't say anything. She said something in her language, something short, and then said in English, "He got away from me at the water." "He's all right," I said. "He was cold, but he's all right." She looked down at the boy, who had his face pressed into her neck. She said something to him and he answered, and she closed her eyes for just a moment. Then she looked at me again and said, "You went in?" "Yes." "Your coat," she said. I looked down. I was still holding the boy's boot. I hadn't noticed. Found it on the bank. She reached over and took it from me. Her hand brushed mine and it was cold from the creek. She looked at the boot and then at me. "Thank you," she said. And then she said it again in what I assumed was her own language, deliberate, like it meant something different that way, fuller maybe. I nodded. I didn't know what else to do. She stood, the boy on her hip, and looked at me with that same quality, reading me, and then she said, "You are going somewhere." "No," I said, and then, because it was the truth, "Not particularly." Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, more like a recognition of something. She looked up the ridge and then back at me. "There is a camp," she said. "You should eat, get dry." I should have said no. A man alone doesn't ride into a camp he doesn't know with people he hasn't been invited to know. That's just sense. But I was sitting on a creek bank at the end of 11 days of no one, and cold through to the middle of me, and the boy had gone to sleep against her shoulder in the way children go to sleep when they're finally safe, just dropped off like a stone, utterly trusting. And something about all of it made saying no feel like a foolishness I couldn't afford. "All right," I said, "thank you." Her name was Amma. She told me that later, not at the creek. She didn't offer it there, just told me to follow, which I did, up the ridge and through a stand of pine that opened into a meadow and the camp. 3 shelters, a good fire, horses picketed in the grass, 2 older women who looked at me the way older women look at unexpected things, without alarm or welcome, just assessment. The boy, Amma called him Njoni, which I later learned meant something like beautiful or good. Woke up when the horse stopped and looked at me from his mother's arms with dark eyes that were entirely too calm for a child who'd almost drowned an hour ago. He studied me the way children study things they haven't yet decided about, with an open and unguarded attention that most adults lose somewhere along the way. One of the older women took him and he went without complaint. Amma spoke to the women in quick words I couldn't follow, and one of them, small, with a face like weathered cedar, brought a blanket and held it out to me without ceremony, the way you hand a thing to someone who needs it without making them ask. I took off my wet shirt and my belt and my boots, and sat close to the fire wrapped in the blanket and let myself come back to warm slowly, the way it works best. Amma tended the boy, changed his clothes, got him eating. I watched her without meaning to, the ease of her hands, the way the child tracked her, the competence in how she moved through the camp, knowing where everything was, nothing wasted. She and the 2 older women were clearly a household of some kind, the 3 of them managing the space with a practiced quiet that spoke of long habit. There was no man in the camp that I could see. I thought about that. The fire was good. Hardwood laid right, the kind of fire that means someone knows what they're doing. I was warm in about 20 minutes, and by the time Amma brought me food, dried meat and something cornmeal-based, hot, in a clay pot, I was something approaching myself again. I ate and didn't talk. She sat across the fire and watched the boy eat and occasionally looked at me in that reading way. I didn't find it uncomfortable. Most people look at you without seeing much. She was doing the other thing. After a while she said, "You have been alone a long time." It wasn't a question. I looked up. "Is it that obvious?" "The way you move," she said. "Careful, like a man who has no one to be careful for." That sat in me somewhere. "I had a wife," I said, 9 years back." She nodded. Not with sympathy exactly, more with understanding, the kind that comes from having lost something yourself and knowing what the sentence means. "I had a husband," she said, 3 winters ago." We didn't talk for a while after that. The fire popped. The boy said something to one of the older women and she answered, and the boy laughed, a sound like water over smooth rock, and Amma watched him laugh and some of the held quality in her face loosened, just for a moment. "He does that too easily," she said, maybe to me, maybe to no one. "Almost dies and an hour later he's laughing." "Children are forgiving of the world," I said. She looked at me. "You believe that?" "I think so, until we teach them otherwise." Something in her eyes shifted. She looked at me for a long moment, then looked away into the fire. "Yes," she said, "until then." I stayed the night. There was nowhere to be, and the cold had settled heavy, and the women had laid a sleeping place for me without being asked, which seemed to mean the question wasn't being asked. I slept deeper than I had in weeks. In the morning the boy was already up and had found my mare and was standing beside her, not touching, just watching her the way he'd watched me, that open, unneedy attention. The mare, who was particular about strangers, had her head dropped and her eyes soft, which meant she'd already made her own assessment. I built the morning fire. I didn't ask if it was wanted. It was cold and the coals were there. The old cedar-faced woman came out of her shelter and stopped when she saw the fire already going and looked at me with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of it. Amma came out later with the boy on her back, and she stopped at the edge of the camp and watched me tending the fire and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You know how to make a camp useful." "Been doing it long enough." "A man who can be useful without being told what to do," she said, and there was something almost dry in it, almost wry. "That is not as common as it should be." I looked up at her. She was looking at me the same way, that reading look. But there was something else in it now, a testing, maybe, or a wondering. I stayed 2 more days. I told myself it was the rain, which came back the second morning and made travel miserable and pointless. But the rain stopped by midday and I didn't leave. I fixed a shelter pole that had been listing. I shot a deer in the afternoon, and the older women showed me how they wanted it prepared, which was different from how I'd have done it but not worse, and I did it their way without comment, which seemed to be noted. I played a kind of game with Najoni that mostly involved me being a horse and him being a very demanding rider. My knees didn't thank me for it. Amma watched all of this. She was not distant. She talked to me, asked me things, answered things I asked. She told me about the country, about where the water would be in a dry summer and where it would fail, about the way the elk moved in fall. She knew the land the way a person knows the face of someone they love. I told her about the hill country, about Cora, about the years of motion since. I didn't plan to tell her as much as I did. It came out in pieces, the way things come out when someone is actually listening. On the second evening, after the boy was asleep, she said, "Why are you still here?" I looked at her across the fire. I thought about a careful answer and decided against it. "Because it's the first place in a long time that has felt like somewhere," I said. She was quiet. She looked into the fire. Her hands were in her lap still. "I do not ask you to stay," she said finally. "I know. But I do not ask you to go." I nodded. Something settled in my chest. A thing I hadn't known was wound up. "All right," I said. I rode out on the third morning because there were things I needed, supplies, grain for the mare, a few tools that were wanted, and I said I'd be back in 4 days. The cedar-faced woman, whose name I'd learned was Dolly, handed me a piece of folded cloth as I swung up. Inside were 3 strips of dried venison. She didn't look at me while I took it. I said thank you in her language badly, and she made a sound that was probably a correction but felt like acceptance. Amma stood at the edge of the camp. Nijoni was on her shoulders. He waved at me with both hands, wide and unambiguous, the way children wave before they've learned to be restrained about it. She didn't wave, she just looked at me. That look. But there was something in it I hadn't seen before, an openness maybe, a door not closed. I nodded to her. She nodded back. I rode. The 4 days turned into 5 because the town was farther than I remembered, and then there was weather, and I found myself riding back in a hurry that I examined, honestly, on the second day of the return. I was in a hurry because I wanted to get back, because there was a place to get back to. I hadn't had that feeling in 9 years, and it was strange and not unwelcome. I came off the ridge into the meadow in the late afternoon of the 5th day, and the camp was there, smoke rising, horses moving in the grass. Nijoni saw me first. He was out near the picket line, and he made a sound that brought Amma to the door of her shelter. She stood there and looked at me riding in, and she did something then I want to try to describe right, because it mattered. She didn't move. She stood with her arms at her sides, and she watched me come in, and there was nothing performed in it, nothing arranged. Her face was the reading face, the held face, but there was something added, like a held breath that has been let go. I stepped down and she came over, not fast, and she took the mare's bridle and held it so I could unload the saddlebags. Then she did something she hadn't done before. She put her hand flat on the mare's neck, and then she put it flat on my arm just above the wrist, and she kept it there for a moment. Her hand was warm. 5 days, she said. Longer than I meant. She looked at me. I counted them, she said simply. I looked at her hand on my arm. I put my hand over hers and she didn't take it away. I brought the tools you said were wanted, I told her. And then, because there was something else in the saddlebag, I deliberated over in the town store for long enough that the storekeeper had given me a curious look. And something for the boy. It was a small horse carved from pine, painted brown with a white blaze. Nothing fancy. The storekeeper's wife had made them. I'd held it for about 5 minutes trying to talk myself out of buying it, and then bought it anyway. Nijoni's reaction, when I handed it to him, was to hold it up in both hands and look at it with his whole face, the way a child looks at something that is exactly what was needed. Then he held it to his chest. Amma watched him and looked at me and said, "He will not put that down for a week." Then I got my money's worth. She almost smiled, almost, that neighborhood again. And then she said it, I think to herself as much as to me, quiet, like something she was working out. "You rode into my heart uninvited." She looked slightly surprised at herself when it was out, like a person who said a true thing before they decided to. I stood there, and I didn't say anything right away. I was aware of the fire sound and the horse sounds and the boy sitting in the grass turning his painted horse in his hands. The cedar-faced Dolly somewhere behind me, moving about, the long light coming level across the meadow grass. "Is that a problem?" I said finally. She looked at me for a moment, the held quality in her face and the not smiled almost smile and something steady underneath it. "No," she said. "I am only saying it is true." I nodded, all right. She nodded too. We stood there in the evening light, her hand still in mine. I don't know when we'd kept holding, just that we had, and the boy talking quietly to his horse, and the camp around us doing what camps do, with the sound of the fire in it, and the smell of pine and rain-washed grass, and the good smell of a meal being made somewhere. I'd been empty for 9 years. That's not a complaint, it was just the fact of it, an emptied thing sitting on a shelf. She'd looked at me that first day the way almost no one had since Cora, like I was worth the looking, like what she was reading was something she wanted to know. And she'd said what she said because it was true, because a woman like that doesn't say things that aren't, and it landed in me the way a true thing lands, not with noise, not with ceremony, just with weight. Needed, that's the word. I had come out of the water with her boy, and she had fed me and made room for me and watched me and let me stay, and she had counted 5 days, and she had put her hand on my arm. And I stood in her camp in the evening light and felt, for the first time in I couldn't say how long, that I was in the right place for the right reasons, and that someone of worth had decided I was worth keeping. It sounds simple when I say it that way, I know it does. But a man can go a long time without that, a long, long time. And when it comes back, it doesn't come back loudly. It comes back quiet, the way warmth comes back to cold hands by a good fire, slow, and then all at once, and then you can't quite remember what cold was. Nijoni came over and leaned against my leg and held up his horse for me to look at. I looked at it and told him it was a fine horse. He seemed satisfied and leaned harder, the top of his head against my thigh, still turning the horse in his hands. Amma was watching us. I looked at her and she looked at me and she said, "Come, eat." So I did. That was 12 years ago. Nijoni is taller than me now, which I find personally unreasonable. He rides the way his mother rides, low and forward, like one creature with 2 purposes. He has her eyes, that reading quality in them, and sometimes when he looks at me across a table or a fire, I think he sees something that he's already decided he approves of. That does something to a man, a young man's approval, when you've been given reason to earn it. We are in the high country now, the 3 of us in Dolly, who is old and imperious and refuses to acknowledge the cold as long as there is a good fire. I built the cabin in the fall of the first year. Amma told me where the timber stood best and what the snow load was in a hard winter, and I built to it. And in 12 years the roof has not leaked and the walls have not shifted. I am proud of that in the specific way I am proud of anything I've made well, not with noise, not with ceremony, just with the knowledge of it. Mornings, Amma makes coffee and brings me mine before I'm fully awake and sets it on the board beside where I'm lying and goes back to her own things, and I lie there for a moment before I reach for it, just listening to the sounds of the place, the fire sounds, the outdoor sounds, the sounds of a life being lived. Her hand on my coffee cup, still warm from hers. 12 years and I still lie there a moment before I reach for it, not wanting to rush past it, wanting to know what I have. That's all there is to say, I think. A man who has nothing particular to be and nowhere particular to go, and a small boy's boot upright in the mud on a bank, and a woman who said a true thing out loud because it was true. And a life that came back to him, not the way he'd had it before, but something different, harder in some ways, better in others, particular in all the ways a good life is particular. The mare is 20 years old now. She's earned her rest and she gets it. And me, I am sitting in the doorway of my own house in the morning light, with my coffee and my ridge and my good view of the country I know by name now, every creak and fold of it, and behind me the sound of the place waking up. "Uninvited," she said. "Yeah. Best thing that ever happened to me."